Hi, I'm Dr. Wilson. I'm a PhD molecular biologist, and welcome to another COVID debunking video. This week, I'm addressing a doctor who I've seen get pretty popular on social media recently, and that is Dr. Malhotra, who went on Mark Stein's GBN News show where he made specific claims about COVID vaccine safety and trends that he sees happening right now in England and Wales. These claims are being echoed as if they're truth by anti-vaxxers all over social media, so let's take a look at these claims and figure out whether or not they're true. Spoiler alert, they're not, but I'm going to explain why that is. So let's get started.
If we talk about the Pfizer vaccine, for example, that trial, it showed this 95% relative risk reduction in infection. Everyone took on board as thinking 95, if 100 people were exposed, 95 would be protected, which is not the case. It was 0.84% from infection.
This is actually a pretty common claim that I see repeated a lot by anti-vaxxers on social media, but it is not correct. The way Dr. Malhotra got those numbers is he calculated the absolute efficacy or the absolute risk of getting COVID in those phase 3 clinical trials. But that's not really a reliable or accurate way to calculate these things. That's why we use relative risk in these clinical trials to determine the efficacy of the drug. The relative risk reduction is that 90+% number that gets reported, and the absolute risk is a much lower number. The reason it's better to use relative risk in the context of infectious disease is because infectious disease can vary in terms of how far it's spreading and who it's affecting at any one point in time. For example, your absolute risk of testing positive for COVID during the year 2020 would be very different if you were in the US, say, versus Australia. Your absolute risk would also be very different if we're talking about the span of, say, a 6-month time period versus a span of 10 years. All of these variables make absolute risk a very misleading number in terms of infectious disease to the general public. And it makes measuring the efficacy of a drug very misleading as well because absolute risk is always going to be a much smaller number than relative risk. So that's why we use relative risk to determine the efficacy of drugs like vaccines, especially in the context of infectious disease. And it makes the most scientific sense too. The way the experiment is set up is you have one group that took the vaccine and one group that did not. Then you wait to see how many people in each group actually test positive for COVID. And among those people who test positive, you see how much the vaccine was able to reduce those numbers relative to the group that did not receive the vaccine. That makes scientific sense, Dr. Malhotra. What's the problem with that? Why focus on the more misleading smaller number in order to say that vaccines don't actually work? That is misinformation. That is harmful to people. You are spreading anti-vaccine misinformation.
In addition to that, Mark, that trial didn't show any reduction in death rates from COVID, statistically significant death rates from COVID, or all-cause mortality.
Yeah, that's because the phase 3 clinical trials were not powered to measure differences in death or all-cause mortality. They were powered to measure differences in who tests positive and who does not. The clinical trials are quite clear about that if you actually read them. And if a study is not powered to measure specific things, then you can't use that study to try and interpret those things. In order to measure differences in things like COVID deaths and all-cause mortality, you would need a much larger data set with many more people. We now have billions of people who have been vaccinated and billions who have not been vaccinated. Among every single data set that we look at on a population level, we see that COVID vaccines are saving lives. They are preventing severe cases of COVID, and the unvaccinated are dying at higher rates than vaccinated people. That becomes very, very clear if you're honest enough to look at current data and not pretend like the clinical trials are all we have to go on.
You know, in reference to the ancestral strain of the virus, which was much more lethal, and it was, certainly, especially for the elderly, it was awful, certainly in 2020, what we experienced then. What's circulating now, Mark, and it's interesting you mentioned Sajid Javid talking about this booster program, is essentially, and this is good news, it's reassuring news, the Omicron strain that is circulating at the moment is no more lethal than the flu.
Seriously? Is this guy stuck in the past? Not only is he only focusing on clinical trial data, he's also still one of these people who thinks that COVID is just the flu. This is ridiculous. Omicron is just as deadly as the other variants. In fact, the peak of the Omicron wave's hospitalizations and deaths were comparable to other waves caused by other variants. And that was despite having a high level of vaccine and prior infection immunity background in the population. The virus was still able to cause a lot of death, mostly in the unvaccinated. And children were more highly affected from Omicron than previous variants. Stop calling it mild, stop calling it the flu. COVID, including Omicron, has killed way more people than any normal flu strain.
Right. We don't scare people to death around the flu. We shouldn't be scaring people to death around Omicron either.
And we don't have to. We have the tools to deal with Omicron. We have vaccines. We have antivirals. We have preventative therapeutics like Evusheld. We have what we need to deal with the virus. You don't need to be afraid of it, but you have to use those tools. But if you believe lies like what Dr. Malhotra is saying, you might not use those tools and you'll be putting yourself in greater danger than what is necessary. So don't listen to him.
So, for example, one very senior NHS leader was shocked to learn that the regulator that approves these vaccines, the MHRA, receive 86% of their funding from the pharmaceutical industry. He didn't believe it, actually. And then the BMJ exposed that only shortly afterwards.
Okay, I've heard claims like this before, mostly situated around the US, but it's the same thing for the MHRA. When pharmaceutical companies submit biological licensing agreements or new drug applications or whatever, then they pay a fee to the regulatory body that has to review that data. Instead of the regulatory agency getting its funding directly from the government, they get its funding by charging the pharmaceutical companies. And yes, most of the money that pays the employees at the MHRA comes from those fees that the pharmaceutical company pays. So instead of getting their funding directly from money allocated by the government, they're getting their money from the fees that their users pay. But if the pharmaceutical companies had it their way, they wouldn't want to pay these extra fees. That's more money out of their pockets. They would rather have the government fund the people who are supposed to be regulating them so that they don't have to pay out extra money. These facts are usually brought up to create an illusion that there's a conflict of interest here, that the pharmaceutical companies are actually paying off these regulators to look the other way, so to speak. But there's no evidence to support that because most new drug applications don't get funded. Most fail the review process. Each new drug application that fails are millions, if not billions of dollars that the pharmaceutical company had lost because the product they invested in to research, develop, and submit to the regulatory body failed. You would not expect that to happen if the pharmaceutical companies were paying the regulatory bodies to look the other way. So please, before you make a claim like this, make sure there's evidence to support it, Dr. Malhotra. Don't just throw it out there and hope that it sticks in the conspiracy world.
So before, let's say, for example, the vaccines came into the equation in terms of the harms, which you've highlighted very consistently on this program, I would have said, okay, this is probably to a large degree being driven by the end result of lockdowns. You know, we know, as a cardiologist, I know how heart disease develops, how people can develop heart attacks quite quickly, how people can have sudden cardiac death linked to lifestyle factors, including poor diet and stress, right? And we know that people's diets got worse and people are under a lot of stress.
Okay, so there's a hypothesis, Dr. Malhotra. You think that lockdowns are causing excess deaths. Let's see if that's true. Let's look at a country that has had extensive lockdown policies and see if their excess deaths were affected by those policies. Well, Australia famously had very extensive lockdown policies, and you don't really see evidence of excess deaths caused by vaccines there. You see a slight peak that is equivalent to a normal flu season during their summer months, but that was caused by a surge in COVID cases. And that peak in excess deaths looks like a flu season because their country is so highly vaccinated. It's the same story in New Zealand, with slight peaks in excess deaths that correlate with COVID cases, but overall these excess deaths are not much higher at all than what we would expect on a normal year. And we see the same thing in South Korea, a country that had very extensive lockdown policies, and their only excess deaths peaks correlate with COVID cases and deaths that occurred once those lockdowns were lifted. So we consistently see no evidence that COVID vaccines are causing these observed excess deaths. In fact, we see the opposite. We see that countries that are highly vaccinated and experience a COVID surge experience much less death than a country that is unvaccinated and has a high COVID surge. But this has been a topic that Mark Stein has explored several times on his show, and so I'll have a video in a few weeks diving deeper into his claims on that topic.
What really concerned me, and you mentioned it in the letter we wrote to President Biden and Boris Johnson and actually published in European Scientist, is very eminent doctors, very eminent scientists, Peter Doshi, associated with the BMJ, Robert Kaplan from Stanford, in one of their preprint publications, they were able to get access to new data from Pfizer and Moderna original trials on the vaccine.
Yeah, this was a pretty popular paper in anti-vaccine circles when it came out a couple months ago, and it's pretty bad. First of all, again, the clinical trials were not primarily powered to measure significant differences in serious adverse events. You have to understand that when it comes to vaccine testing, the purpose of a phase 3 clinical trial is to measure general safety and efficacy. That's what the phase 3 clinical trials measured. And of course, the clinical trials found that the vaccines were very safe and very effective. But vaccinologists know that they have to worry about what happens after a phase 3 clinical trial. They have to worry about once the vaccine gets rolled out to millions of people, because it's only then that they're going to see rare side effects occurring, rare side effects that are, say, 1 in a million chances. You're probably not going to see a 1 in a million chance event occurring in a population of 40,000 people. It's just not very likely. That's why we have post-market monitoring systems that monitor safety data from millions of people, gather it, and analyze it. So regardless of what Peter Doshi and his team of cranks, yes, I'm calling them cranks, think they found in their preprint looking at clinical trial data that is over 2 years old now, you would expect that same observation to remain true in larger data sets. But they did not even bother looking at those larger data sets, which, guess what, conclude that vaccines are very safe. The fact that they don't bother to test their hypothesis further by looking at larger data sets in this preprint shows a lot of dishonesty, and that's why I'm calling them cranks. They should know better, but for some reason they choose to focus on data that they know they can manipulate to send the message they want to send, and that is one of an anti-vaccine sentiment. That's not okay. So that's the gist of that paper, but it's been covered more in depth by other science communicators, and I'll link their content in the description below.
And then I recently discovered, and people can look this up, the FDA, since May 2021, on their own website have stated that this is an unreliable surrogate. Antibodies are not reliable in terms of telling you whether you're protected from infection or protection from COVID, especially after COVID-19 vaccinations. Right. That's extraordinary.
No, it's not. The FDA is talking about antibodies as an immune correlate of protection. Just because you have antibodies against a pathogen, that does not mean you are protected from severe disease. That has always been true, Dr. Malhotra. Please brush up on this basic virology and basic immunology. You can measure an antibody response given after a vaccine dose and say that the vaccine is working to create an immune response, but you can't say that that is an immune correlate of protection. That's why you have to do the work in a clinical trial to see who actually tests positive and who does not, and then do the work after that to see, are vaccines actually protecting people against severe disease. For example, as we have seen with Omicron, pathogens can evolve ways to evade antibodies, and if you don't have a robust immune memory or a robust T-cell response, then you might not be protected from severe disease. So yeah, antibodies alone are not going to tell you whether or not you are protected against severe disease. If this is a confusing concept to you, then you should just either defer to experts or try to learn more about the topics before you form opinions on them. And no, Dr. Malhotra is not an expert because he clearly does not understand these things. If you want to learn actual science, then I'm going to link all the science that I talked about in this video and more in the description below so that you can check it out for yourself and actually learn something that won't happen by listening to Dr. Malhotra here. Well, that's going to do it for this week's video. I do hope you've enjoyed it. As always, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. And if you liked this, don't forget to subscribe so that you can catch me next week where I'll be debunking some more funky stuff. See you then.